Potty 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 pod podcast. Potty 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 pod podcast. We love an audio stim and self-acceptance. It's the AuDHD Psych Podcast. Did you ever feel like autism, ADHD, or even both didn't quite fit you? Well, you're not alone, and the research is starting to show that. Hi friends, welcome back to the AuDHD Psych Podcast. I'm Aaron Howearth, clinical psychologist, and we are different, not defective. Today, we're going to be speaking about the AuDHD presentation and how that looks as distinct from autism and ADHD, and the fact that it's more than just the sum of its parts. So I've got the lovely, delightful Dan here helping me out tonight, and I'll ask Dan to kick on with the questions. Just before we do, just a friendly reminder, this is not therapy. This is general information for education purposes only. If you are having difficulties, please find an affirming Please find an affirming clinician in your area to seek support. So I'll hand over to Dan for our first question.
It's a nice and easy one, straight off the bat. How is AuDHD being defined and recognized?
So I guess I'll take that back to 2015, beg your pardon, 2013. So prior to the DSM-5 being released in 2013, we didn't allow the diagnosis of autism and ADHD together. Autism under the banner of pervasive developmental disorder was deemed to be the reason for ADHD characteristics if they occurred in a person who was diagnosed with autism. Why does that matter? Because it means that if you received the diagnosis before 2015 and you're an ADHDer, it's more than likely one or the other, not both. Why does that matter? Because it's likely then that some of your characteristics were missed. So since 2015, the DSM-5 was changed to include the co-diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. So formally, we define AuDHD, which is not a formal diagnosis in its own right, by the diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. But within community and within the research, we're starting to realize that that's not all that AuDHD is. It's actually more than just ADHD characteristics plus autism characteristics. It's also some interaction between the two and some characteristics and differences that are actually completely separate of autism and ADHD. And I'd like to think that answered the question, but I've completely forgotten it. So let's carry on.
It was defined and recognized. So when did you first notice that you were AuDHD?
So I formally diagnosed ADHD about 4 years ago, and then I moved into the diagnosis space as part of my clinical work and started to recognize that a lot of the people that I was diagnosing with autism were described an experience that was the same as mine. A lot of things that I just considered to be my normal, so everybody else's normal. People were going, oh, I've got this stim and it's this. Like, I do that. Oh, and I find this really challenging. Like, I find that really challenging. So for me, I had the formal diagnosis of ADHD, but then I recognized that I like routines and rules. So I didn't just fit into the novelty-seeking and impulsivity and inattention tangentiality of ADHD. And then seeing my autistic assessment clients for diagnosis, I started to recognize that I actually tick the boxes for probably around a level 1 diagnosis of autism as well. And that's within the last 3 years. So as we've talked about before, I self-identify. I choose not to get a formal diagnosis because there are lots of people who don't have access to diagnosis. And there are lots of people who don't have access to clinicians who understand the interaction of autism, ADHD, and those differences that come with being AuDHD. And it's a high risk of a non-diagnosis where there is a diagnosis there. So to say to people, you are valid, I choose self-identification rather than formal diagnosis. In terms of that question, I think that answered it. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, it did. So what are some of the cognitive differences between autism, ADHD, and AuDHD?
Okay, there are so many. There are so many cognitive and executive functions that are implicated in neurodivergence more broadly. But, we were talking about this earlier. One that I really like, or that springs to mind now, is the difference between autism, autism, ADHD, autism plus ADHD, and AuDHD. There was a study done on, I want to say, 6 to 16-year-olds, but that age group might be incorrect, on young people. And they looked at different cognitive functions, and the cognitive functions they looked at were planning, or executive functions, planning, attention, simultaneous processing, and sequential or successive processing. And slap yourself in the chest there. So very much so. I love this, but I really do. So planning, attention, simultaneous, and successive processing.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did is they had a number of groups. They had typically developing kids. They had, there's no such thing, but they had pure autistic children, pure ADHD children. And by that, I mean children who only fitted the diagnostic profile for autism and those who only fitted the diagnostic profile for ADHD.
I was worried you were going to say grown in a field.
I do love a field. But the final group they had was obviously AuDHD kids.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was, compared to typically developing children, autistic children had greater difficulties or greater differences with planning. ADHD children had greater difficulties with planning and attention, but AuDHD children had greater difficulties with all four of those areas, both planning, attention, successive processing, and simultaneous processing. So if I'm not great at planning, that's one thing. If I'm not great at planning and keeping my attention on task, that's a complex interaction. If I'm not great at planning, keeping my attention on task, and processing multiple things either at the same time or one after the other, it's going to have really big day-to-day impacts on me and my daily life.
Oh, absolutely would. So with autism and ADHD, both can have contributing factors to anxiety and depression and overwhelm. How can that contribute to the AuDHD experience?
So the AuDHD experience, obviously, as discussed, some of the characteristics of autism come into play, characteristics of ADHD come into play, but there's also different characteristics. So if autism, and I love numbers, as you know, if autism contributes 5 points of anxiety on average, and ADHD contributes 5 points of anxiety on average, and I make the diagnostic criteria for both, it's likely that I'm going to have probably more than 5 points of anxiety. Why does that matter? Because let's assume that it's 5 plus 5 equals 10. Just as the additive components of autism plus ADHD, there's 10 points of anxiety or stress that I've got. But then those genuinely separate things that aren't explained by autism or ADHD, but are seen in AuDHD, they're going to add extra layers of anxiety or depression or stress. But there's another bit of research out there. I'm terrible with names, so I won't even try and pretend to get people's names or years right, but it's relatively recent. Talks about AuDHD as being more likely to be internalizers rather than externalizers. So we're more likely to internalize and mask our characteristics when they're unhelpful in settings or when they're deemed unhelpful or inappropriate, which means I'm going to be putting more cognitive and emotional energy into that masking, into that management of my particular characteristics. That's going to probably increase my anxiety, which will increase my stress and reduce my overall well-being.
Yeah, so those contributing factors, it's just going to be overall worse.
Very much so.
So
in some contexts, though, so, you know, the different, not defective, our characteristics aren't inherently broken. And so the environments that we're in change whether or not our characteristics express in ways that hinder us or serve us.
Can you speak on the energy economy with AuDHD, especially when you have the opposites of novelty-seeking versus strict routines?
Yeah, so looking at energy costs of managing an AuDHD presentation. So if I'm really, really restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, for example, I'm really set in my routines, there's energy required to do something new if I'm required to suddenly, unexpectedly fly into state for a family emergency. There's energy required to do that. It's cognitive energy required in my planning, which we just saw in that research in neurodivergent kids is not a strong point in autistic kids. But then also, I am just going to make some noise for a second while I remember what the question was, energy economy. But if I'm also, so let's say I'm managing that, but I'm also quite inattentive, for example, because I've got ADHD characteristics, I might need to break my routines, which costs me and my energy, my cognitive energy, and probably an emotional burden there as well, then I'm having difficulty keeping my attention on task. So I'm struggling to book the flights that I need to, book the accommodation that I need. So my stress is increasing there, more energy required to mask that inattentive or tangential difference. And then if I have difficulty with sequential processing of things, okay, first I need to book the car to the airport, then I need to book the flight, then I need to book the accommodation, I'm going to have more difficulty in applying my cognitive resources into that particular task. So my stress is likely to increase. The higher my stress is, the harder it is for me to apply those cognitive strengths and weaknesses that I do have. So the more difficulties I'm going to have, the more difficulties I have applying them, the more emotionally dysregulated I'm likely to become. Long term, as that goes on, I'm likely to have more and more burnout related risks and all of the health implications that can be associated with stress hormones, things like that.
I personally find that I will start to beat myself up if I don't do the task.
Absolutely. And I think it's pretty common. And I know I do that as well. We want to follow the rules. We want to be conscientious. And that's sort of a central characteristic to who we are. But we're also inattentive and impulsive. So we notice the distraction and we're like, oh, pretty bird, I'm going to go play with it. And we don't challenge that impulse. And then we're like, oh, I failed at doing the 3 hours of study I was meant to do, or writing the report, or whatever the thing is. So there are multiple angles to the stress, anxiety, and the more anxious and the more stressed I get, the more prone I am to depression, the more likely I am to end up with those safety-related concerns. But again, if I'm in an environment that doesn't demand me to be particularly rigid, or teaches me that I can be a little bit rigid in some ways and routine-bound and a little bit novelty-seeking in others, then my stress in those environments changes. You know, we've grown up in a very productivity-oriented world, and that really leads to a lot of the internal conflicts that we have, in my humble opinion.
So you were talking before about studies revolving around younger people. What are some of the key differences in early versus later diagnosis?
So I guess early versus late diagnosis, and I come back to 2013 with the DSM-5. So people who were diagnosed before that, people of my age who might have been diagnosed before that, would have been diagnosed with potentially only half of their differences being identified. Now, I want to hasten to point out there were many clinicians out there back in the day going, there are characteristics of both here that warrant diagnosis, but the systems in place didn't allow that. So there were some people out there going, yep, I'm going to diagnose you with autism because that's the greatest difficulties that we're seeing related to your autism in life. But also you've got ADHD characteristics that warrant managing. And there's probably vice versa as well. So I don't want to say all clinicians weren't highlighting it or noticing it, but structurally and systemically, we didn't allow for it, so it wasn't the norm. So lots of things were getting missed. But we also know now, the research is bearing, that there are structural differences in the way our brains are activating. There are differences in our cognitive functioning that aren't accounted for by either autism or ADHD. So if you were diagnosed early in life as somebody who's midlife now, there were elements of your AuDHD presentation or your AuDHD experience that just weren't even known, that are starting to become known now. Late life diagnosis can be a double-edged sword, and we've touched on this in the past. One, it can be a grief process where I'm like, well, what could I have been if I'd known that I had ADHD characteristics for my attention and autistic rigidity in other areas, and these processing differences that the research is showing in younger people at least. What could I have been if I'd known that earlier? And that's something I see a lot in clinical practice, is people that are like, yeah, but I could have been so much more, or my life would have been so different. My experience of late life diagnosis and identification is very different. Mine is all of those things that I beat myself up for before, that I was like, I'm a terrible human. Now I'm like, oh, actually, I didn't understand my brain. Now I do. Now I know how to manage it. And I can forgive myself for being not typical because I never was, but I was taught that I should have been. And because I wasn't, it was something that I was doing wrong. But actually, it was just a different set of resources in an environment.
I always thought of it as, I didn't realize I was living on hard mode. So the world went from black and white to color. Everything sort of just made a lot more sense from how I think.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful.
And that's so true of so many people. That's not my experience as such because, and, you know, we know each other in a personal world. You have relatively high intellect. That's quite clear. And I was graced with that as well. That's also a part of my divergence of the way my brain functions from average. And so I've had difficulties and stresses, and I want to clock that. But I've also had a great deal of enablement from the way my brain functions too. And that's allowed me to be super impulsive and super inattentive, but also still skate by as average for a long time, when a different person who didn't win brain genetic lottery might not have been able to do that.
Yeah.
But I need to clock also that that's not to invalidate the difficulties that you had and that a lot of other people genuinely do have in community. Like clock your privilege and recognize that not everybody has that. I think it's a really important thing that we can take from, you know, queer politics and queer community.
Absolutely. Can you speak on AuDHD and adaptive functioning?
So this taps back into, I really think, that cognitive functioning conversation earlier. If AuDHD has autistic cognitive differences plus ADHD cognitive differences plus AuDHD specific cognitive differences and neurological differences, then there are going to be different applications of those things in daily life. Yeah. So you and I might have all of the same cognitive profile, except for, say, that serial processing. And we both do jobs where we have to do step-by-step things in a really rigid way. If I'm an AuDHDer with that particular cognitive characteristic at greater levels than yours, I'm going to have a harder time doing that. Booking a holiday, organizing my grocery list, things like that. Things are going to be much more overwhelming for me because we do need to process a lot of different things at the same time or in quick succession. So how does AuDHD present and in fact impact my daily functioning? Well, it might be that I'm not great at booking my holidays. It might be much more important day-to-day things like I'm not really great at organizing myself and getting down to the shop to get the groceries. And if it's the case of those daily life things, for anyone watching on video, the reason I'm smirking is because one of the dogs is out the back whining and making grunting noises that they're not getting sweet, sweet love and scratches. So if I have a lot of those situations where I have difficulty in doing those day-to-day living tasks, that impacts on my self-concept, that impacts on my stress levels because maybe I'm not eating well. And if I'm not eating well, I don't have the energy to exercise enough to keep me healthy.
What do you mean I have to drink so much water?
Oh, exercise impacts my cognitive functioning. So if I'm not exercising and eating well, that's doubly impacting my cognitive functioning and my neurodivergent characteristics. So my day-to-day living, sometimes just getting up to have a shower is going to be a lot. Throw in anxiety and stress in social settings where other people are judging me. Yeah. And when we talk about the PDA profile, you can see how that can develop. If I'm anxious in all settings where I'm expected to do these things, my brain functions differently and I have a history of being told that I'm not doing it well. It's going to be hard for me to engage with any sort of expectation that's placed on me because I lose confidence in my ability to do it.
Yeah.
The flip side is, the flip side is change the environment. We change the expectations, and we change how our characteristics express. Different, not defective.
If someone has been living their entire life with an incomplete diagnosis, what are some of the possible strengths of having an AuDHD brain?
So many. You know, I always talk about the great problem-solving brain that AuDHD is, or many AuDHDers have, and I don't want to suggest that it's exclusive to an AuDHD brain, but there is a details and a systems orientation that comes with autism. It's really commonly seen in community and in a lot of the research. It's why we have stereotypes of, you know, mathematicians and engineers and IT engineers being very autistic communities because there's systems, there's rules, there are systemic and rules-bound interactions in place. Sounds perfect for an AuDHD brain, an ADHD, autistic brain. Wow, I struggled with that. ADHD is known for inattention, which at its extreme is tangentiality. In some situations. When I'm trying to solve a problem with a system, as a psychologist, it's a system of interactions that is human experience. My time in the Navy, it was equipment interactions in IT and radio systems. I know the system, so I know how the systems work and each part interacts. That's that systems details orientation of autism. But the ADHD tangentiality means that I will see an interaction between things that the average person might not recognize.
Yeah.
I will see how something in point A will going through point B and point C can influence point D, which then points to a problem at point D rather than point A or point Z.
Yeah.
And applying that process, that details orientation and that tangentiality or that associative thinking, is a great boon in my work. But as you know, I had some really significant conflict with somebody I love so dearly over the summer break, and it was exactly the same process at play. My brain linked together things that weren't actually related because there was anxiety overlaid there, and it caused a lot of conflict. And when we look at generalized anxiety disorder, we see a very similar thing there. We see a brain linking stress through anxiety together, and then everything in my world becomes a stressor or an anxiety-provoking thing. And I can result in a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, which I think many, not unlike borderline personality, I think it can be a diagnosis that's applied to an AuDHD style of thinking, but it's exactly the same psychological process as is that problem-solving brain that I described a moment ago.
So it swings and roundabouts. What might be a negative at one point can be a great positive in another one.
Very much so.
That's awesome.
Everything has a contextual influence on whether it's helpful or unhelpful.
How can we manage our AuDHD lives to minimize those difficulties and maximize the strength?
I think knowing ourselves and what our characteristics are, because our characteristics and the difficulties or strengths are interactional. And we all have different domains of life that we experience. We all have different workplaces, different family lives, different social settings. We all are going to have a different set of our characteristics interacting with those environments. And so the help or the hindrance is going to express in different ways for every single person. Knowing what my characteristics are, knowing where they're helpful and where they're not in my life. And then looking at where they're not helpful and going, where is it worth me putting the energy that I have into making change?
Yeah.
Is it worth me, I don't know, challenging my desire to interrupt you because I get really excited about what we're talking about? I'm like, oh, but I have a thing to say, and if I don't say it now, I'll forget. Is it worth me interrupting you, challenging myself and stressing myself out to do that when you and I do that quite often together? And we accept that that's our style of communication. And I want to clock that so many ADHDers, particularly ADHDers, we do that. I heard somebody once describe it as a beautiful form of active listening, and it really is. I think of my dear friend Nicole out there. Somebody once asked, "Do you guys ever finish a sentence?" Because we were so in tune that we would just cut one another off. Not worth masking, suppressing that particular characteristic because it's not unhelpful. If I'm doing it in the workplace and I'm overspeaking my manager or the director of a company that I work for, probably worth challenging there because that impacts my livelihood. If I'm doing it in settings where it's causing significant conflict and social difficulties, might be worth challenging there. Knowing what my characteristics are, how they express in different contexts, and then assessing the cost-benefit analysis. What's worth the energy, the limited energy that I have to expend, and what's not? And of the ones that are worth changing, what's the most impactful? What's going to have the biggest difference in my life for either the biggest difference that I've got the energy for or the biggest difference for the least amount of energy. So I have more energy to give to the things that bring joy to me.
I like that. With self-advocating, what could someone say to an affirming clinician to request an AuDHD diagnosis?
Can I have an assessment of ADHD and autism? But also, I think a really important question is, do you understand the current science around an AuDHD presentation? Because ADHD can mask the expression of autistic characteristics. My impulsivity can make it look like I'm not stereotypically rigid. but my autism can mask my ADHD characteristics. My rules orientation, 23 years in the Navy, if I could follow a rule, that can mask some of my impulsive. It didn't do a great job for me personally, by the way, but that could mask some of my ADHD impulsivity. And if, as an assessor, I don't recognize how those things can be additive or subtractive or mask one another, and I don't understand those AuDHD specific differences, it's going to be really hard for me to make a full, ethically and professionally sound diagnosis. Because if I don't know what the characteristics are and how they present, I can't really assess for what they are. So if I'm a clinician, I want to be reading the research. I want to be reading the lived experience research, the quantitative research out there that's demonstrating the differences between AuDHDers, autistic folk, ADHDers, and the typical community. I need to be around that so that I can say to you, this is how your mind functions. This is how it's, impacting you in your life. And this stressor you told me about, this is how we can manage that. That's the point of diagnosis, to come up with a treatment plan and facilitate resources to make your experience of life better.
It's also important to not assume knowledge of somebody just because they're a professional. You need to find the right clinician for you.
Absolutely. And, you and I have had the conversation. I don't love the word expert. I think the day that I personally start referring to myself as an expert is the day that I stop believing I have something to learn. And we always have more to learn because our systems of constructing knowledge are so flawed. But they're what we have, and they're the best that we have for an informed evidence-based practice. And so we lean into them.
Awesome. Some people describe feeling in between. What are some ways that they can reframe those thoughts to assuage some of the implied negativity of that?
I mean, the things in between things also bind things together. They're the glue of the world, right? So absolutely. And, one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is I feel simultaneously not enough and too much, that real in between the autism and the ADHD of it all. And actually, you're not in between one or the other per se. You are both and more. You're not the sum of autism plus ADHD. You're actually an AuDHD profile. And that is both encompassing ADHD and autism, but it's also a whole lot more. So if we think of ourselves as kind of caught in the middle or not quite one or the other, actually, that's probably true and more, where we're caught in the middle because we're more than one or the other. We're actually a whole lot of characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses.
Why bring one dish to the party when you can bring a whole buffet?
And my novelty-seeking loves a buffet. Give me all the delicious.
What is one thing you want people to take away from this episode?
As always, we're different, not less. And again, and I just touched on it then, this notion that AuDHD is autism plus ADHD or, ADHD with autistic characteristics, I think that can be and has a real risk of being harmful, because if I don't understand myself, I can't apply myself in the ways that serve me. If clinicians don't understand the presentation, we can't create treatment plans that are effective for you in your life and your context. And our treatment plans should always be personalized to you, not treating autism as a bulk set and forget, not treating ADHD, but treating your presentation of AuDHD in the context of your life where it matters to make change. So just, there's nothing wrong with you. You're different. You're not less. And we're starting to know more and more about AuDHD. So we're starting to be able to better understand ourselves through that label.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am out of questions.
And I'll thank you, Dan. And thank you all for listening today. We appreciate all of your support. Again, all of the comments, all of the subscriptions, all of the likes, follows. If you do have a chance, please give us a rating on your streaming platforms, because that helps spread the word that we are different, not defective. We will see you next time, friends. Take care. Where's the button that stops? We went a bit long, actually. And that will have an impact in terms of, I'll find something